With the announcement of Apple Card, I felt compelled to create this very short little deck about the vulnerabilities in the insurance industry. But this is not just being spurred on by the launch of Apple Card. It's been spurred on since kind of interacting with a lot of people within the insurance industry and observing from an outsider's perspective what the vulnerabilities are of the overall insurance industry. And I think it's important to realize, what vulnerabilities actually are that lie in the industry and how that should be perceived going forward and how that can be worked on. Because as we've seen with many different industries, there have been innovations, changes, and the way that humans actually interact with these changes often is with skepticism initially about how that new thing is going to impact their business models in the industry. But then also, once it starts to happen, it's like the law of physics. If you push something, it slowly starts to move, but then as you go, it gets quicker and quicker at progressing and moving forward. So this is an outsider's look inside, and it's very much my opinion and Nodeunlock's opinion, but I would really welcome your thoughts on what we're about to dive into, because I think there are some elements that people aren't speaking about, and I'd love to kind of bring them to the forefront of conversation. So, the first thing is that the insurance industry is a 200 plus year industry, ultimately, and the industry overall acts like it in the way that they engage with their customers, in the way that they engage with people within the industry, and how they actually work together and communicate as well. So, with this, there is a level of comfort in the industry that I've seen. It's almost a level of comfort, but also ego in the way that people are approaching the new world and how people actually want to use insurance, but then also how they want to be communicated with, how they want to be made to feel if they are using or purchasing an insurance product. So with comfort comes serious vulnerability, and not the type of vulnerability that can be used as a tool. It's very much vulnerability that is on the negative side rather than the positive side. And it's the kind of vulnerability that does lead to extinction. And really, extinction being the way that insurance is being done today and has been done for the past 200 plus years, the way that we know it and what we see as the industry today is potentially going to become extinct if certain things don't change. So let's think about this for a second. We have a level of comfort in the industry that is actually not going to allow people to progress and understand the world that we live in and we're going to be moving into. But there are many moats that the insurance industry are leaning on, and these moats have been around for a long time, but they are very, very much diminishing rapidly. So if we have a look at the moats that we have here, we've got four moats here, right? The first one being the regulatory oversight that the industry has is a fundamental moat, and that's the number one moat ultimately, because all of the insurtech companies or any startups that are looking to create a new insurance product and service and offering ultimately need to feed into the incumbents and the ones that have the regulatory oversight of the overall industry, because you need to be licensed. So all of the MGAs, brokers, all of the new insurance players need to feed into these gatekeepers ultimately, and that is a huge moat and has been for a very long period of time, but that is slowly being gnawed away at. The second one is industry opacity. So you have an industry that loves to make things complicated. And insurance is not rocket science. Insurance is absolutely not rocket science. And people are hiding behind the fact that the industry is highly opaque and is not transparent and not open to outsiders, but then also within the industry, just how people communicate and interact. Capital access. So ultimately, the insurance products need to have capital behind them to actually be worthy of the regulatory oversight that is required. But that is again very quickly diminishing in terms of moats that can be leaned on for the industry, because you have very big players out there that have unlimited pockets, okay? Unlimited pockets. And it doesn't take a lot to provide the capital that is required to create an innovative insurance product. So again, when we think about the moats that we have here, this one is very rapidly being removed. So the likes of your Amazons, Apple, we know that if you look further east, you have the likes of Ping An. They are very, very quick at moving. And if you were to think about how you go about creating an insurance product or service that is new, or you're trying to cater to a new market, can you actually rapidly move as quickly as they do with the same thought processes that they have that are very much further forward than what the incumbents in the insurance industry are thinking about? And finally, you have data availability. So ultimately, all of the actuarial calculations and looking at how the insurance products may perform going forward and what the appropriate premiums might be. Ultimately, that needs data, and you need to actually have some quantitative data behind it. And the incumbents and the large insurers and also brokers have a lot of this data, but one, it's highly unstructured, and people don't know what to do with this data and aren't using it to the full benefit of themselves. But then also they're not willing to actually share that data. So with the data availability, when we have insurtech companies and other new players coming into the market, they need to get hold of data that allows them to understand their product and service and map that out going forward. But again, data availability is becoming very, very much less of a moat, and it's not something that will be around forever in terms of being able to be leaned on as well. So these moats are rapidly diminishing, and the insurance industry really needs to understand that these are no longer something that can save the profit margins and also the business models that you're currently using. So with that, if you think about these are rapidly diminishing, however, you might then think moats are being eaten. Lunch is well and truly being served. So if all of these moats are being eaten, what is next, ultimately? So if you have a little think about if they are being eaten, what do you do next? However, there is something that people are not speaking about in the industry that I've realized and recognized from my interactions with the industry people, humans, players in the market, and that something is vulnerabilities. Okay, vulnerabilities are not being spoken about now. Vulnerabilities can be used as a tool. It can be used as something that fuels the fire. It fuels the progress. It fuels the diversity of making things happen going forward, because you understand your vulnerabilities and you can actually use them to your advantage. But that's not what's happening in the industry. It's not happening in the industry now, and it hasn't happened in the industry before because of various different reasons. So the insurance vulnerabilities are fourfold again. You have legacy thinkers and legacy thinking within the industry, but then also within the organizations that build up the industry. You have a high number of people who are very much stuck in the old ways of thinking. And then also, if you overlay that with, it's not just old ways of thinking, but this is how it's always been done, and this is how it should be done going forward. Those types of legacy thinking concepts really are huge vulnerabilities for people in the industry, because what worked yesterday and what worked before does not necessarily actually work going forward. And that's a really important point that people are starting to really need to get their head around ultimately. So that's the first thing. You have a lack of customer centricity ultimately. Before there was the moat of opacity, and ultimately, people needed insurance for various different reasons, be it from a professional standpoint, personal, or if people are looking to create a product and service and they have to have insurance for various reasons. However, the fact is, in the insurance industry, customer centricity is non-existent. People are not coming from a customer first standpoint and perspective and understanding what the today's customer and tomorrow's customer really wants, but not just what they want, how they actually interact with the world today. We're not seeing this, and we're not seeing this both from an external perspective when you think about customers, but then also internally when you think of entrepreneurs rather than entrepreneurs. The first things that people should be thinking about is, how do we understand what our customers really want? How do we understand what our customers really need? And going to them and speaking to them and really having that open dialogue. That's not happening. So we have a lack of customer centricity. And then you also have a lack of diversity of thought. And that leads very much from the 200 plus year way of working in the insurance industry, where people are not thinking about different ways and cultural ways of approaching the insurance products and services and how humans operate today. And that is another fundamental vulnerability as well. And then you distill that all down to, you have a lack of radical transparency, and that's both internally and externally in regards to the opacity that is being used. Now, I want to dive into this a little bit more because it's really important to understand why and where that is coming from. And the first thing from a legacy thinking perspective is, the number one issue here is that we have a very large percentage of the senior management, senior leaders in the insurance industry who in the next 3 to 6 years are going to be retiring. And ultimately, it is not in their own interests, and there is zero incentive for them to move quickly or to actually take some potentially career changing or risky moves to steer the ship in a very different direction than is happening at the moment. And that's a huge vulnerability, because you have people who are leading the organizations are not moving rapidly enough in today's world. They don't want to take that risk of potentially, having that reputational risk if something doesn't happen according to plan or it doesn't work out, right? But if you think that you're going to be capable of hiding behind that kind of 3 to 6 year window, things change very, very quickly today, and it's not that you can now use that still as an excuse not to move forward and innovate. So this is the number one vulnerability for the industry as well. You have a lack of customer centricity, and there is an audacity in the industry around not listening to customers actively and creating products and services, as well as supporting humans within the industry around building the customer proposition that is required. So customers aren't being put first, and being actively listened to. So this is another huge vulnerability as well. We mentioned the lack of diversity of thought, where you have a very interesting analogy actually is in the media industry previously you had media moguls who were the ones who were, gatekeepers of whether or not stars were going to be born, or if they liked you or if they disliked you, whether your career was going to take off, whether your product and service was going to take off as well, if you needed the cooperation with these media moguls. But again, we have seen that the industry changes, and no longer in the media industry do we actually require the need to go to these media outlets who potentially have more diversity of thought these days, but actually we don't need to do that because we have very different ways of getting our product and service and information to the customer these days. And it's almost like you need to circumvent the way the industry and the insurance industry is working currently in regards to the approach, because it's very, very much like the media days, where currently we still have that 200-year plus way of thinking, the lack of diversity both from a age perspective and then also from the cultural perspective as well. So this plays into another huge vulnerability that is very, very critical in getting right and removing those barriers to progression as well. And then you have the lack of radical transparency, being that people in the industry are deploying complete opacity with what the processes, the services, the communications, the way of interacting both internally and externally. They're deploying that as a strategy to make sure that there is a moat around them that keeps them in position, keeps them in a position of power. And this can be at various different levels as well, not just right at the top. The whole industry talks in acronyms. They talk in very much their own language, which is great. Industries have their own languages, etc. But not just that. Insurance is not rocket science, and it's been made to be complicated, and we've seen this in the asset management space, asset servicing, banking, all of these different industries where previously the fundamentals of trying to understand how the industry worked and distill it down to its fundamental truths was very much one of their moats, and this is another vulnerability, because when people come to the industry and simplify the processes, the way that people are working, the way that people are interacting, and the way that they are bringing a product to market, that's a huge vulnerability for incumbents, but also the overall industry as well. So radical transparency is not being used as a tool. It is very much seen still to be opaque and not show what is actually going on. So again, vulnerabilities are feeding those who get it, and those who get it are the rapid movers, the small insurtechs, the very small startups, but then also the large innovative companies that have massive war chests of funds, but then also humans who are thinking in a very much more kind of innovative way. So again, those who get it are feeding off of those vulnerabilities and using them to their benefit. So what are we going to do with this? It's an important one where you kind of need to think about something here as well. So a simple analogy here is that the human behavior of anything new, you have people who are very much open to growth, to change, to moving forward, and welcoming a new way of working, a new perspective, and a new way of thinking. But then, if you have a think about the smile that was on the horse owner's face, right? When they had a whole bunch of horses back in, when cars were non-existent, and you invested all of your money into your fleet of horses. And then the car came around, and slowly, people started to clock on that the car was a far superior piece of technology, a far superior way of moving goods, services, and information back and forth, instead of horses. And the smile that was on the horse owner's face gradually moved from smiling, grinning, very happy, to ultimately understanding that they were very much non-existent anymore and extinct. And that's what's happening at the moment in the insurance industry. It's not something that, people are recognizing because it's a slow moving animal. But ultimately, the insurance industry is in the horse versus car battle. Yet, at this present time, it is a far worse situation than the horse versus the car. And I'll tell you why. The reason being is that in today's world, information and technology changes rapidly, and those advantages actually diminish far faster than in the car versus horse battle. So it's interesting. Will the insurance industry be caught with its pants down? Are they going to recognize the vulnerabilities and understand how they need to rapidly change the way that they are interacting with the world, and the way that humans are interacting and want insurance products and services today and going forward? Or, it's possible that people actually innovate themselves out of existence, but realistically, there will always be that kind of change in how the business models function and work, and the people who move forward quickly with understanding that they need to innovate themselves out of existence, but actually use that to their advantage and build a completely different product and service or business model behind that, they are the ones that actually flourish in the future as well. Or you can always have someone else innovate you out of existence, and that's something that is very much a possibility within the insurance industry as well. And just a quote that I think is profound. "Freedoms once granted will not be relinquished without a fight." Robert Ciliandini, should I say, says this, and I think that people within the insurance industry, are not oblivious to the vulnerabilities that exist. However, when you have a number of people having groupthink and are just stuck, with their heads buried in the sand, trying to change things with the kind of tools and resources that they have, and still having to fight the leadership that is thinking in this kind of legacy thought processes, there needs to be that fight. There needs to be that, change in the way that people approach the work, the way that they interact with their customers, and the way that they are creating products and services. So, with that, it's only a matter of time before the industry actually has a proper shake-up. Just like we've seen with banking and the open banking movements, the insurance industry really could do with a shake-up in regards to open transparency in some kind of shape or form. However, in the interim, you have very big, large players that are looking at the industry, trying to understand, how best they simplify an industry that is overly complex, but doesn't need to be, and moves at a very slow pace. So, it's time to upgrade your thinking, ultimately. Upgrade your thinking, the way that you approach the new world, and realistically, how you try and move those vulnerabilities into something that can be a tool rather than just something that is going to hold you back in an anchor. And the risks behind that are huge. They're immeasurable in terms of why and how you need to start changing the way you're thinking. So, we have very much more to say about this, and I wanted to highlight the vulnerabilities of the insurance industry from an outsider's perspective because I think it's important to have this conversation and discussion. Very much would welcome your questions or thoughts regarding this, and if you have positive or negative thoughts in relation to how I and we have created the vulnerabilities perspective here, and then also the moats and how that might be actually used or can be diminished, like we've seen. And until next time, thank you very much, and I'm really looking forward to hearing from you and your perspectives. Take care.